So the first hypersensitivity is hypersensitivity type 1. Better color going on here. So hypersensitivity type 1. So this is allergic reactions. These are going to be immediate. Like you come into contact with it and you immediately start exhibiting symptoms. So in this type of hypersensitivity, you've got this antigen. So here's this antigen. Okay, so antigen or allergen, however you want to say. And for whatever reason, you eat something, you breathe something in, whatever, and it causes some kind of reaction. So causes, I should mention causes, it's like the triggers of reactions, really. But anything that you ingest, so like foods, breathing in things like dander, like animal dander and fur and stuff like that, bee stings, so bee venom, getting stung, molds that you come into contact with. You may be allergic to some kind of drug or medication that can cause an allergic reaction, pollens, flowers, things like that. Also, skin type things, latex. If you're allergic to some kind of lotion, some kind of soap, you can get have an allergic reaction to any of those things. So basically what goes on, or what happens, is we have this antigen, and basically this antigen is, or binds to, or is presented to a CD4 cell. Okay, so a CD4 cell, of course, becomes a T helper cell. And it's a special kind. It's called the type 2 cell. And it goes and activates B cells. And it activates B cells. And then these B cells start barfing out or producing IgE antibodies. All right, so that's kind of what happens when you become sensitized to it. Okay, so during that initial sensitization time, and usually during the first exposure, you're not really going to exhibit a lot of symptoms. You might, but a lot of times it's completely asymptomatic. So these IgE antibodies during this first initial exposure, these IgE antibodies link themselves or attach themselves onto mast cells. So these IgE antibodies, make them purple. Okay, so they attach themselves to these lovely mast cells. Boom, boom. Pain to make, but look how pretty that is. Okay, so what does a mast cell do? What is it about mast cells? Well, here's the deal with mast cells. Mast cells contain these vesicles or whatever, but it contains a bunch of histamine. So histamine granules. So whatever, all over the place here. Okay, so that's what they contain. And during this initial sensitization, we have these IgE antibodies bind themselves to these mast cells. So I'll write that out. So during initial sensitization, so, this is where the body first sees it and then decides, oh, that's not something good for us. So IgE antibodies bind to mast cells. All right, so that's the first exposure. All right, you're getting sensitized. All right. The next exposure is going to be worse. You're going to have reactions there, and every exposure beyond that will generally get worse. So in the next exposure, so we'll just take pollen for example. So you had pollen, you smelled pollen in this last spring, and so in this next spring you smell pollen again. So that pollen, then we already have our reaction. So we already have these mast cells that have already been coated with IgE antibodies. So what happens, so now we have this mast cell, okay, and this is the mast cell with all this granulation in it, this histamine stuff in it, and basically what happens is these antibodies that are on it, these are the IgGs, okay, and when they see that antigen again, they bind to it, and what happens is it will bind to one, and if it binds to the other one as well, so here's my antigen, this is called cross-linking. When they form a cross-link on the antigen, that means two of them bind, then that triggers. So the cross-linking of these two antibodies with this one antigen together triggers the mast cell to degranulate or barf out all of that horrible histamine. So what happens is now the cell basically opens up and all the histamine gets dumped out. So the more times that you're exposed, the more mast cells you're going to have, the more chance of cross-linking and the more histamine that you're going to have dumped out. So what kind of things what does histamine do? So let's just kind of look here. So histamine, what does it do? Well, it causes mass vasodilation. So vasodilation, okay? So it makes the vessels get really big, okay? Their lumens are getting really big, all right? And what does that do? That slows blood flow, right? So vasodilation, they increase the vessel permeability. So the vessels are getting dilated and the blood that's in there is seeping out anyway because the vessels are permeable. And we've got all kinds of solutes like even proteins are maybe getting out of the vessel, so the fluid's leaving the vessel even more. It also causes bronchoconstriction. So this definitely explains why people that are going into anaphylactic shock have a hard time breathing. Okay, so the symptoms of this are going to be things like allergic rhinitis, so runny nose, dermatitis, maybe a rash, something like that, asthmatic symptoms, and eventually all this can eventually lead to anaphylactic shock. If you have systemic, vasodilation, like vasodilation all over the body, and those vessels are permeable, so the fluid's leaving anyway, and then you can't breathe, your blood is basically halted. It's basically stopped flowing, okay? So that causes anaphylactic shock. So it can be very serious, and every single exposure after that sensitization exposure, every single one after that gets worse and worse and worse, usually, okay? Antihistamines can help because antihistamine, that will decrease the vascular permeability, and it will bring down some of the bronchoconstriction issues. Steroids decrease the inflammation, okay, so you can do that. And epinephrine, when we have, we're going into anaphylactic shock, an epinephrine shot is really going to be the most valuable, because that's going to cause mass constriction of the blood vessels. So that is hypersensitivity type 1.